Okay, great. Muchas gracias. Well, buenos días. Gracias por la invitación. I am so delighted to be here with all of you this morning. I wish we were in person, but unfortunately, these are the circumstances that, we are dealing with at the moment. So, but glad to be with all of you virtually. Gracias a Pilar. I recall when I was at the Association of American Medical Colleges and Pilar came to talk to us about these great ideas she had, and to see this work grow and to see the team grow is just so inspiring, so wonderful. So thank you to all of you for all that you do and for continuing to advance these issues. We couldn't do it without supporting one another in this space, so thank you. So today what I'd like to do is share some insights into my new role at the National Academies as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Prior to that role, I served as Senior Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Association of American Medical Colleges. I spent about 16 years there or so doing this work, specifically focused on advancing these issues in academic medicine. So I'd like to share a little bit about the role of a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, but more specifically, talk about how I, as a Latina, was drawn to this particular work and how it has specifically informed my approach to leadership in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also want to spend some time discussing how the DI lens can be applied to practically any field, any type of work that we do, and how all of us as leaders really need to advance these issues on a daily basis. So it's more than just these big initiatives, but what we can do locally and what we can do on a daily basis to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's what I'd like to spend my time with you this morning. Here are our session objectives. Before I discuss my role in the work that I do at the National Academies, I want to start by discussing what diversity, equity, and inclusion means specifically to us at the National Academies. And then we'll briefly discuss why it matters broadly and why it matters for the work that we lead at the academies and why it's critically important that we take a DEI lens. And then also want to spend some time describing how health professionals can incorporate public health equity, diversity, and inclusion into their own academic trajectory. So hopefully I'll be able to accomplish all of this very quickly this morning. So let me start by talking about the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's essentially about achieving excellence, right? It's not the end goal, it's to get us to institutional excellence or excellence in everything that we do. So at the National Academies, this is our definition based on our recent strategic plan for diversity. Not very different from many other definitions of diversity, but what I really want to highlight here is that it's a more inclusive definition of diversity, right? If we're going to really address these issues, we have to be inclusive in our approach to diversity. Here's our definition for inclusion. And inclusion is simply leveraging that diversity, right? Using that talent, putting it to use, right? I think you may have often heard, you may have heard this phrase, diversity is being invited to the party while inclusion is being invited to dance, right? And so diversity by itself is not sufficient, but you need that inclusion to really get to those benefits. Belonging is also part of inclusion, right? And belonging is simply the experience of being accepted, included, and valued by others, right? It's it's the interpretation of cues that suggest we fit, right, and that we're welcomed. Unfortunately, we know that when we have exclusionary practices, right, it can hinder belonging and lead to isolation, diminished trust and effectiveness within our organization. And it can also lead to emotional distress, health issues, and impact our overall well-being. So the lack of inclusion within our organizations can also diminish innovation, development of new ideas and practices, which is not what we want, right? I also want to connect equity, right? Because equity is also part of the equation, right? And equity contributes to inclusion because it's essentially about the norms and the policies that are in place that ensure that everyone has access to opportunities, right? All three are important. There's an interdependent relationship, and all three are necessary for us to get to excellence. And so I wanted to spend some time highlighting these three. In terms of the benefits, right, of diversity and inclusion, they're not going to rehash it here, but there are over 40 years of social science, higher education, and studies in the business community really that demonstrate how a diversity can lead to more innovation and more creativity and more complex problem solving, for example. And when we think about the work that we do at the national academies, that's important, right, to have diversity at the table because we're essentially doing studies and convening experts to advance issues in science, engineering, and medicine that ultimately advise the nation. And so you see the direct connection and importance of having diversity. Inclusion is also important for our organization, and you see many you see a long list here, and there's so many others that in terms of what inclusion brings to organizations, right? Including enhanced employee morale, productivity, job satisfaction, all of which are necessary in order for us to have a thriving workplace culture, right? If we're not thriving within our culture, then we're not doing the best we can to advise the nation on these issues. So just wanted to spend some time talking about why this is incredibly important for the work that we do. So let me talk a little bit about our strategy to tackle these issues within the national academies. And I want to, as I talk about this strategy, I want to highlight the importance of collaboration. And here's where I begin to address why I think who I am as a Latina helps me in this space, right? I think about my upbringing and I think about the importance of collaboration and partnerships and the community and my familia, right? This was all part of how I grew up. I grew up thinking beyond just who I am as an individual and how to engage others and the importance of coming together to address issues. And so this is why this is important for me in particular in terms of how we approach this work at the National Academies. Collaboration is essential for us to get to inclusion within our organizations. And so I share this model with you that we have applied in order for us to understand where we are as an organization and where we want to go. And I really like this model because there are many models around inclusion that present inclusion on a continuum, but this one in particular brings in anti-racism principles. And we know how important this work is for our organizations now to move to recognize that we have been systemic racism has been part of our cultures, and that we need to move towards an anti-racist culture. So I really like this model, and it's the model that we've been using to guide our work. I want to highlight the process. Again, the process has to be, in addition to being data-driven as we do this work, comprehensive and evidence-based, it has to be collaborative. And so here you see some of the initial steps. I just joined June 1st, and I hit the ground running by conducting organization-wide listening sessions to really understand the leadership, the staff, our members and volunteers, and get a deep understanding in terms of what they experience and how they envision this work moving forward. There's been a lot of collaboration with leaders across the organization, right? We recognize that alignment is key with leaders in order for us to be successful. And immediately I identified who are those existing DEI champions and content experts, and how do I engage them in this work? Because they're going to be essential for us to be successful, right? This is not a work that one person or one office can lead on their own. Immediately began by engaging members and volunteers, like I mentioned, to get their insight and their perspectives, because they too are part of the culture of the national academies. And then spending lots of time reviewing existing data and resources and just really trying to understand what's been working so that we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. So just wanted to highlight this just to give you a sense of the collaborative nature of this work. We also know that there's important components, right, in order for us to truly advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I've listed just 7 of them here. On the left here, you see areas of work that I believe we're doing pretty good, right? I think there has been recognition and value of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the national academies. We are beginning to prioritize this work, especially in parts of the organizations where it hasn't been prioritized. And we are beginning to allocate resources and build our capacity. But on the right-hand side, you see areas where we have yet to have an impact. One of the first things that I am working on is establishing our first DEI council to develop this multi-year DEI action plan. So this group will be represent folks from across the organization so that we can ensure that we get buy-in and we develop a plan that is actionable. And then the other three areas you see listed there are really about culture change, right? We have to be prepared to not just to listen, but to learn and to change our behaviors, our practices, and our systems based on the data and the evidence. We have to learn to hold ourselves and others accountable. And we have to learn to communicate and support data transparency. And those are tough issues because it's essentially about culture change, and anything around culture change can quickly get quite complicated, right? So let me share the strategy that we have proposed to advance these issues at the National Academies. This is a very high level view. You'll see 6 areas of work. It's a comprehensive and a cross-cutting strategy. But we recognize that, as I mentioned, we're talking about cultural change and behavioral and systemic changes, which are all necessary if we are going to truly advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism. And so that's why you see a pretty bold and comprehensive strategy that we're proposing. And so to very quickly walk through what these different areas mean and what we're envisioning there. So the number one that you see listed there is about building our infrastructure and our capacity, right? That's establishing our DI council, establishing employee resource groups to help empower our staff to have voice. It's getting the resources necessary to do this work and establishing the partnerships that we're going to need to be effective. So this is all new work that we are building. And then number 2 is around the culture, right? And fostering a culture of inclusion and belonging for all, right? For our staff, for our members, and for our volunteers. And so that includes conducting assessments around our culture and climate around DE&I. It also includes developing an education strategy to deliver training on various areas, from bias to anti-racism to inclusive leadership, for example. But it also includes developing an infrastructure to enhance cross-organization collaboration and exchange of ideas. How do we create those safe spaces so that many people can come together and work together, but also be comfortable sharing, right, ideas and, to move these issues forward. Number 3 is about our hiring and our advancement practices, right? Really spending some time reviewing and revising our practices, our policies, and our procedures in these 2 particular areas, and ensuring that we have transparency in terms of how this happens, and that we can eliminate as much bias from these processes as possible, right? And then number 4 is applying that DEI lens to our work. And I'll share some examples later on when I talk about the way that DEI can be applied, a DEI lens can be applied to practically anything that we do. And so that's really looking at our work and making sure it's intentional and strategic and at the beginning of initiatives and not as an afterthought, right? And then number 5 is around enhancing our policies, our processes, and our practices to diversify our members, our volunteers, but even thinking about our contractors, right? And even thinking about our local community and how we engage the community where our organization sits, right? And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of increasing accountability, communication, and data transparency, right? So that may include developing DI dashboards and really focusing on strengthening our communication and sharing data even when data is not positive, right? But just creating that culture of transparency. So just want to give you a sense in terms of what I'm doing and what potentially a chief diversity and inclusion officer might do to advance these issues within organizations. if we look at what our ultimate, what would success look like, right? Our ultimate goals, what we would envision if we are to be successful, you see that the first item that's listed there, it's really about people's lived experiences, right? And that's why it's important that we foster a diverse and inclusive workplace culture where everyone feels welcome, that they feel valued, safe, respected, that sense of belonging so that they can thrive, right? So that we can all do our best work. So it's about the people, but it's also about the systems, right? And our practices. And so that's why number two is about making sure that those practices and those policies are inclusive, equitable, anti-racist, and as bias-free as possible. And then it's about the work that we do, right? And applying a DI lens to all that we do, right? And lastly, I think if we're successful in those three areas, could we potentially be successful and be recognized as an organization that utilizes DEI as a strategy to execute on its mission, which is to advance the nation around science, engineering, and medicine, and to address the biggest pressing issues that we're faced with. So let me pivot here and let me talk about how I think my identity as a Latina intersects with the work that I do. And when I think about my experiences growing up, I really, this quote by Booker T. Washington really resonates with me. Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which one has overcome while trying to succeed. And, you know, I often hear, why do you do this work? It's challenging. It's ultimately about changing culture. I've always been drawn to trying to solve solutions, to tackling challenges, because that's part of how I grew up, right? I learned about resilience and perseverance from my parents, right? And from my family members. And so when you grow up in that way, you are always asking yourself, what's the solution? How can we change things? And how can we improve things for all? Right? You're thinking about how you can make things better, not just for yourself, but for your community and for your familia. So let me share a little bit about where I grew up and my earlier experiences and how I ended up doing the work that I do. So this is where I grew up. I grew up in New York City, specifically in that building you see right there in the middle. On 125th Street, which is pretty much the intersection of Harlem and Spanish Harlem. So earlier I mentioned that my parents, I come from a Cuban father, and my mother was Puerto Rican. So I like to say I'm New York Cubariqueña, just to mix it all up and make it interesting. And, you know, my parents demonstrated that strong work ethic, resilience, discipline, persistence, and of course, lots of love and lots of food. And so that just really set the foundation for who I am. And I always felt that even though there were going to be obstacles along the way, if I kept at it, if I went around another way, I would get through it, right? I would be able to figure it out. I went to public schools in New York City, and I was the first one in my family, I'm sure like many of you probably, to graduate from college, and definitely the first one to go on to complete graduate studies. And so when I think about what led me to this work, I think about some very important undergraduate experiences, right? When I first started college, I wanted to be a vet. I wanted to go to veterinary school. And I took my first science class, and I didn't do too well. No one advised me. I think I took a chemistry class and a physics class my freshman year, and I just didn't do so well. And I thought, maybe I'm not cut out for this. But I kept at it, and I took my first biology class. And what was interesting, if you think about, I grew up in the 1980s in New York City, and we were dealing with an AIDS epidemic. And I was seeing my community just dying on a daily basis. I just saw family members, I saw neighbors no longer be there, like just literally overnight. And so I remember being in my biology class and the professor talking about how this virus impacts the body. But when she started to talk about how it was impacting our communities, that's where I became interested. And I realized at that moment that, yes, understanding how it impacts the body is important so we can get to some sort of cure. but understanding how it was impacting the community was giving me answers, right? It was helping me understand what I was seeing in my community. And so I said, what is that called? And I spoke to the biology professor, and she said, you might want to take a political sociology class. And so that paved the way for me to begin my work in the social sciences. It allowed me to apply my critical thinking skills, to question what I was seeing in society, and to think about ways to improve my community in particular. So I fell in love with the social sciences, and I left the natural sciences behind. And that's how it all began. I went on to pursue a PhD. Originally, I thought it would be in political science, but then I thought to myself, I want to be able to apply this work. I want to be more than just a faculty member. And so I switched to education because I felt that I could have more of a hands-on approach to this work and still have the social science background. And some of my earlier research was around resilience and trying to understand what factors in particular contribute to educational success for Latinos and Latinas. So just wanted to share that background with all of you. After graduate school, I continued to learn about leadership and how to become more of an authentic leader, right? Where I could be true to myself. And I came across some of these resources that have been really helpful to me. And I'm sure there are many, many more, but I want to share these with you. The first book you see listed here, The Power of Latino Leadership, Culture, Inclusion, and Contribution by Juana Boldas, was really enlightening for me, as she talks about 10 Latino leadership principles that really resonated with me. For example, she talks about personalismo, and that's essentially about treating others with respect, regardless of status, right? She also talks about what she calls juntos, which is about union and community and working together. And she talks about conciencia, right, which is about self-reflection, examination in order to understand why you do what you do. So I just felt like, wow, I could think about my upbringing, my cultura, and how I could bring it to who I am, right, and how I interact with others. The other book there, also written by her, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, was also really helpful. And she covers other principles like learning from the past, right? And perspective taking, right? It's so important to try to understand how other people experience things and how they see the world so that we can engage them, right? And we can learn from one another. And focusing on collective identity and also the importance of generosity and giving back to others. And then the last book I share there, Everyday Injustices for Latino Professionals and Racism, was really helpful in understanding and dealing with racism and discrimination, right, on a personal level, and how we're often seen foreign, right? This notion of what I call a Latino seen as the perpetual outsider, right? No matter how much history we have in this nation, we're seen as this outsider. Or what some Puerto Rican scholars have called ni de aquí y ni de allá. And it just reminds me of traveling to Puerto Rico as a young girl to stay with my grandmother and feeling like I didn't know where I belonged, because when I got to Puerto Rico, they would say, tú no eres de aquí, you're not from here, you're from the north. And then I'd come back to New York City and they would say, you're not from here, you're from Puerto Rico, right? You're from abroad, you're foreign. And so one day I just realized, wait a minute, I'm just both, all right? And so I learned to think about myself, not feel that I didn't belong, but that that was all part of me, right? So I just wanted to share these resources with you that have been so helpful to me. And then lastly, want to discuss how we can apply a DEI lens in all that we do. And as public health professionals, you can all contribute to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism and ethno-racism in all that you do. Why? Because health equity is essentially social justice for health, right? It's not enough to just study and understand health disparities, right? And which are useful, right? We have to understand health disparities so that we can measure progress and we can understand group differences. But health equity is essentially about doing something more, right, with that data and really advancing the health of our communities. As I mentioned earlier, working at the national academies, I've been exposed to other fields beyond medicine and health. and have had an opportunity to really see the link and the connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion in other areas of work. So I'll give you one example here. One big unit at the National Academies focuses on transportation. And most recently, I had an opportunity to participate in this really fascinating 5-day conference, all focused on equity in transportation. And it resonated once I started to understand how all of these issues, how, for example, transportation equity is directly linked to policy actions in so many areas such as housing, education, economic development, nutrition, healthcare, recreation, and many, many more. And I think about growing up in New York City with lots of modes of transportation, but personally experiencing how transportation kept my family and my community segregated and limited our access to quality healthcare, to food, and even to safe recreational activities, just to name a few. So just wanted to give you an example how DEI can be applied to practically any field, right? But it must also be applied to our everyday actions and interactions with colleagues. Yes, it's important to address and champion these issues and these causes, but also to bring our new voices in, to support one another, to empower other Latinos and Latinas and Latinx colleagues, to bring them up with us. And I think as Latinos, we do a pretty good job at that because it's embedded in our culture, but it's just so important, right? To keep that top of mind, that on a daily basis and amongst our colleagues, we need to support one another. So with that, I give you las gracias. Happy to have a dialogue, happy to be here with all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to present this morning. So thank you.
How about a virtual round of applause for her? Gracias, doctora Castillo-Page. Su presentación nos ayudó a profundizar el tema de la identidad Latinx y contextualizarlo en un ambiente profesional. I can now say for certain that we learned a lot about how health professionals can incorporate that public health equity, diversity, and inclusion into their own academic trajectories. So we're not going to move forward. Ahora es mi gran gusto pasar el micrófono virtual a una amiga mía, previa becaria de Mola y estudiante de medicina en la Universidad de Illinois, María Gabriela Valle Cotto.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you so much, everyone. Buenos días a todos y gracias por acompañarnos en esta mañana. My name, like Renee said, is Maria Valle Cotto. I'm a third-year medical student at UIC, and I'm a former Moreland Scholar. And it is my honor this morning to introduce our next speaker, Mario Teto Jr., who currently serves as the Secretary of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. Secretary Teto has a long history of advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion in both the public and private sector, and he's intimately familiar with the struggles of vulnerable communities when it comes to seeking medical care. In his current role, Secretary Teto oversees the regulation of over 1.2 million professional licenses, including licensing for doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, and works at the intersection of policy and healthcare accessibility. This morning, he will be guiding us in conversation regarding Latinx representation in Illinois healthcare, an incredibly timely topic given the severe provider shortages we have seen in our state through this pandemic. Démosle una gran bienvenida al Secretario Teto.
Thank you, Maria. Buenos dias. It's exciting to be with family. I go on these speaking engagements and it's always in English, and I can really say that I'm excited to be here. I hope everyone had your cafecito, your pan dulce to start the morning, because we're ready to go and ready to talk about some diversity, equity, and inclusion and things that the state of Illinois has been doing. I really liked Dr. Castillo-Page's morning session because I think it set up a really strong foundation with some of the things I want to talk about. So, as you heard, my name is Mario Teto Jr., and I'm proud to serve in Governor Pritzker's cabinet as the Secretary of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. I am also the immediate past board chair of Howard Brown Health, which is a federally qualified health center here in Chicago. That's also the largest LGBT organization in the Midwest with 11 clinics all throughout the Chicagoland area. And Maria, I want to thank you for the warm introduction, and really to MOLA staff and volunteers who not only made today's event possible, but really this is an organization that's making a lot of positive change across the state of Illinois and beyond. So thank you all for that. Thank you, Dr. Ortega, Oscar, and the rest of the team. Again, your work in advancing Latino participation in healthcare by uplifting our lived experiences is a mission shared by our Illinois governor, and it's one that I personally hold close to heart. And how we can extend that mission together is what I really want to talk about today. So before I do that, though, I want to take a step back and share some personal details about my personal story and what brought me to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. For time's sake, we shorten that to IDFPR here in Illinois. Like many of you on this call, I'm a proud first-generation American. My parents, Mario and Rebecca, were born in small villages in Mexico in the state of Zacatecas. It's in central Mexico, north of Guadalajara. Both came from modest means. Both were forced to end their schooling in the 6th grade on account of their family's financial constraints and expectations for them to work. But both of them had a personal ambition. They had ganas for a better life for themselves and for myself and my sisters and our family. So it was that drive that brought my family to the American Southwest at the age of 16 as a migrant farm worker before moving to Chicago, marrying my mother, and raising their family in our city's vibrant La Villita community. If you're in Chicago, I definitely recommend you stop by. It's a little bit of a taste of Mexico here in Chicago. My childhood there was marked by memories of playing in the fire hydrants on summer days, which now as a regulator, I strongly advise against that, and eating delicious Mexican candy in the city streets with some of the kids. So, but some of the memories also had a little bit of an adult role. I was the sole translator for my family. I'd accompany them into government offices. I'd help them do their taxes, help them pay their utility bills. And what was a surprise to many newcomers to the United States, figuring out that you can't build structures without city permits and the like. So I just say this all to illustrate that diversity to me is more than ethnicity. It encompasses our lived experiences as well. The details of our lives matter. It's a distinction that's especially germane in a community as diverse and multifaceted as ours, which encompasses the history and heritage of no less than 2 continents and an entire hemisphere. My own understanding of this came as I began to venture out into the world. Among the many blessings I received growing up was an affinity for academics and the many teachers who took me under their wing, who really helped me throughout high school. My high school didn't have a large high matriculation rate, much less a high college retention and graduation rate. So I'm really thankful for them in helping me. It's easy for us to take the college application process for granted, but not with families like my own. There were times where I had to include some of my teachers in conversations with my parents, explaining the differences between a 2-year community college like the one that was down the road and a 4-year institution that I was hoping to attend and one that was out of state, no less. So as I mentioned earlier, details matter. My understanding of the importance of lived experience grew further once I entered into college, where the Latino population represented less than 2% of the student body. It also had the dubious distinction of having the lowest socioeconomic diversity in the United States, with the fewest number of Pell Grants awarded. So I say that because I stood out, and I'm sure that many of you have had those experiences in college and beyond. I'll never forget one of the first conversations I had when I first went to school, and a classmate let me know that I was the first Latino that he knew that wasn't mowing his lawn or working in a grocery store. He told me I was pretty good for being a Mexican. Words that I'm sure, you smile at the moment to be polite, to be friendly, to not rock the boat. Words that can be even intended to be a compliment, but they might be misguided. But words that nonetheless sink into you and stay with you and hurt. For the first time in my life, the things I celebrated about myself, my name, my family, my Mexicanness became things of shame. Though I continued to perform well academically, the first year was very tough for me. It was very difficult. I was learning to connect with a number of different individuals, a number of different people that I shared the floor with. And so they essentially, I was connecting with people from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from Kentucky, and sharing my Chicago, again, lived experience with all of them. Here, I'm sorry, I'm having So I share these stories just because us as Latino professionals, again, we can all bond over that. We also share these stories to demonstrate why the notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't just feel-good terms for me. It's a basis for how we create a society that's more just, more inclusive, but more successful. So we need those experiences at the table, and that goes double for public institutions that serve them. And so with that mission, I went to law school. I went to the city of Evanston, where I was a city attorney there. Worked on restorative justice issues, historical housing discrimination, expungement of juvenile offenses, which disproportionately affected minorities. It also extended into my work at Howard Brown Health. So there we had to be strategic and intentional with where we grew. And Oscar, who's on this call, was a board member as well. It was a predominantly white organization, and we had to be, again, we had that strategy. I like that Dr. Castillo Page mentioned being strategic and intentional with everything that we do, and that's what we did there. So we made sure we went to the south side of Chicago, the west side, and went into Black and brown communities because we have to be able to help all of our fellow humans in whatever way we can. And doing it in a culturally competent way is really important. So with that, I was excited of the work that I did there, and I was honored to be appointed within Governor Pritzker's administration again. And I now have been secretary since April. But going to IDFPR in our agency, to give you a sense of the department's scope, you heard that in my introduction. We're the principal regulator of over 1.2 million licensees in Illinois, and that covers over 140 professionals. That includes doctors and nurses, such as yourself, but it also includes psychologists, cosmetologists, real estate brokers, architects, engineers, and other financial providers, state chartered banks, credit unions, financial institutions. But what ties all of these together is our passion for consumer protection, fairness and efficiency, and our mission for holding bad actors accountable. So there are a couple of things that I want to disclose and share about our agency, and I think that this is important for us as state regulators to communicate with our providers, with our licensees, but consumers alike. In the medical field alone, we've been able to shrink our open investigations by 75%, with similar gains in our pharmaceutical investigations. We onboarded a number of different new professionals within the agency, a deputy medical coordinator in Springfield, Illinois. So now we have 3. And we have a fantastic chief medical coordinator, Dr. Shami Goyle, who came from us from the Lake County Public Health Department. But again, ethnicity isn't enough when we speak about diversity, just like regulation isn't enough when we speak about the success at IDFPR. We're continuously striving to be the best version of ourselves, living on the lived experiences of the communities we serve, and constantly working on advancing our values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The earlier speaker mentioned about the importance of having a DEI committee, having a really strong strategic plan. So we were able to do that right away. And it's also important to have Latino voices. I know that each and every one of you is in a position or will be in a position to decide who gets a seat at the table. And it's important for us to be able to have those seats. And oftentimes when I talk about seats at the table, individuals think that we just replace some of those seats. I encourage you all to build a bigger table and just keep adding more and more people that have those experiences that will help us out in the end. Within the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, we have 4 divisions, and I'm excited to say that we have 2 of the directors of our Latino. Our Division of Financial Institutions is Francisco Menchaca, who also hails from Mexico. And then Director of Professional Regulation, which oversees doctors. The director is Cecilia Bundes, who is a proud first-generation American and native Chicagoan too, whose parents immigrated from Mexico City. Her family also served the public at some level of government. So I say that because it's leadership that it's important for us to take key steps to reflect our state's diversity. We've been able to increase the number of scholarships available for minorities to enter into certain professions. We've been able to encourage that we disseminate language in our top 3 non-English languages. So we think about those that aren't able to speak Spanish. I think about the times that I would go with my mom to her primary care provider, and I was, a young boy, an 8-year-old boy, trying to translate information to her. A lot of it that was personal health information, but there was no other way for her to be able to achieve obtaining quality health care without having her son there. So as a regulator, I think it's important to disseminate that information in multiple languages. Viewing our actions through an equity lens can lead to difficult but necessary questions. And I'll be quite honest and frank with this group about that. For example, when we assess the licensing of medical professionals working in low-income communities, we take into serious consideration the broader healthcare picture of that area. We ask ourselves, is healthcare equitable in that community? Does that community have the resources to receive the care it needs? And is care being provided in a culturally competent way? Those answers can literally mean the difference between life and death of our residents. For example, if we revoke a license of the only doctor in a community like that, are we imparting justice, or are we doing a greater disservice to the community at large? This is what I mean by difficult and necessary questions that come from viewing our work through an equity lens. Another example is when we receive a license request from physicians working in large minority communities such as Waukegan or North Chicago, both of which have high Hispanic populations here in the state of Illinois. We take into consideration whether or not these physicians can communicate with the residents they serve, whether or not they are personally sensitive to their lived experiences, and whether or not they're someone they can trust. Issues that are not strictly medical, but critical in delivering care for their patients and closing the broader care gap that we see across our state. We saw the life or death impact of these issues play out in real time with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know that you all have been talking about that extensively. First, in the rate of incidences and deaths that was outrageously weighted to our low-income communities and communities of color, and then again with disjointed vaccination rates among many of these same communities. Some of these issues were due to the lack of access to quality healthcare before the pandemic, which extended into the pandemic itself. But some of it also stemmed from the lack of access to quality information, allowing misinformation and distrust to thrive. That led people to refuse the life-saving vaccine, or in our Hispanic communities like the one I grew up in, fear that seeking medical care will lead you and your family to being deported. A story that we all know too well, and that I personally know very well from some of my family members and friends. As a result, communities needlessly were putting their lives at risk, and lives were needlessly lost. I know that many of us have been impacted by the pandemic, and I myself lost a dear aunt to it because she didn't have access to some of these services in Mexico. And so we think about ourselves here in the United States and Illinois, the importance that we have and the huge responsibility that we have in ensuring that proper information is being disseminated. So with that, I can talk a little bit about what our department did. COVID spurred our department to take important actions around healthcare access, including delivering prescriptions and telehealth efforts, which I'm proud to say that we continue to build upon this day. We also continue to address the challenges of equity and inclusion. And in order to be able to do that, we need to start young. We talk about the pipeline efforts all the time, but we need to put some of those words into action. I mentioned earlier that we have a scholarship program that really allows for minorities to enter into certain professions. My hope is that we continue to work with that type of program. We've also done other initiatives to engage more students of color. So our department's nursing coordinator has regularly scheduled meetings with the deans of nursing from both 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities within Illinois. We've also developed collaborations with nursing programs and other organizations to see what we can do as a department to advance quality care through an equity lens. I want to finish my remarks. I know that we're tight on time, but I want to turn to all of you. And I spoke recently in Colorado at the National Hispanic Elected and Appointed Official Conference, where we were talking about some of the initiatives that we were able to do. And I kept saying the word juntos, 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 juntos. We needed to do things together. We'll never reach our shared goals if we don't work together. So as the head of IDFPR, I'm asking each and every one of you to get involved with your regulatory agencies within your states. Again, I am speaking to the broader sense because we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also not just in your capacity as medical professionals, but also as members of the public with other institutions, other regulated professions as well. Here in Illinois, the Division of Professional Regulation has 48 professional boards with many vacant seats. That means that we need individuals with your voices, with your lived experiences, with your perspectives in those seats, so that you can bring that experience onto those boards. You know, for example, we have Structural Engineering Board, a Marriage and Family Therapy Licensing Board. We have open seats right now that we can fill today. We also have the Physician Disciplinary Board that I'm always looking to when board members term off. Looking for diverse voices to fill those seats, because again, it's been too long for us to not have those seats at the table and be heard. So I say that for all of you to step up, make your voice heard, make your community heard. I'm asking all of you, again, as head of IDFPR, and this is for the state of Illinois professionals, I'm, you know, as I talk to different organizations, tell us what we can do better as regulators. Tell us how we can be the best versions of ourselves. You know, sometimes, again, with regulation, you think of us versus them, but really it's a we. We need to work together. So for the Illinois medical professionals, you have an open door policy to me. Feel free to indicate anything that we need to be doing to make sure that we're working on those diversity initiatives in the best way possible. No matter what our ages are, our backgrounds, we need to share the legacy of those that came before us. That's something that I tell everyone. We stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, and trust me, I can say that that's 100% true. But we also have a moral obligation to continue to pave the path forward for the generations to come. That happens, again, by all of us working together for a common cause. And here in Illinois, we're ready to lead that charge, and we're ready to do it again with partners across the country, with other regulators. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for everything that you've been doing. I personally, on a side note, just medical professionals, you've been incredible heroes during the pandemic, and appreciate everything and anything that you have done for many of us. I know that a number of lives have been saved because of the work and the hours and the sweat and tears that, quite frankly, you all have put in on a day-to-day basis. So thank you. I hope this is the start of a conversation. I know that we have another speaker and we're going to have a question and answer session, but I just want you all to know that I'm happy to answer any questions, happy to receive any comments, and looking forward to hearing from more speakers during this conference. So with that, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Secretario Treto. Definitely inspiring words. Thank you for being vulnerable, as Reniel said, and sharing your own story. Inspired a lot of us to work with you and to know your story. So thank you for those words. And now I would like to introduce Jose Alberto Figueroa, one of our former interns and medical student at Northwestern, and scholar, very involved with MOLA, and very proud to call him, like Mario, my friend too.
Muchísimas gracias, Oscar Iván. Hola a todos. Buenos días. I'm so happy to be here and see everybody here. I have the daunting task, but absolute pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. John Paul Sanchez. Dr. John Paul Sanchez is an emergency physician and currently serves as the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences. Through his medical practice, research, and community involvement, Dr. Sanchez has demonstrated a lifetime commitment to transform the healthcare system by delivering culturally competent care to underserved communities and spurring innovation that can lead to better health outcomes for all. To this end, Dr. John Paul Sanchez has made himself a leader, a mentor, and a voice for young and rising underrepresented minorities who want to pursue a career in medicine. He's the founder of Building the Next Generation of Academic Physicians, an organization that mentors, educates, inspires, and elevates underrepresented minority community members to consider careers in academic medicine. And he currently serves as the executive director of the Latino Medical Student Association, a 140 plus chapter organization that focuses on highlighting and supporting Latino medical students in our unique journey in the medical field. I could go on and on with all the incredible things that Dr. Sanchez has done. He's a native, he is a fellow Boricua, so I'm happy about that. But I'll let him continue for his talk, which is about identity in academia, how important our identities as Latinos, as all the intersections of identities that we have, like how important they are in career development. And yeah, Dr. Sanchez, you can take it away.
Well, good morning. Buenos dias, everyone. It's great seeing the Mola family. Thank you so much, Jose. Just one clarification, because I want to do right by my boss. So Dr. Romero Leggett, a Mexicana, is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. And I serve as her Executive Associate Vice Chancellor. She has been an incredible leader in the state of New Mexico for over 20 years. So thank you for that intro. I just want to make sure I acknowledge her as a sponsor and mentor to me and to many of us. I just have a couple of slides. I apologize, I tend to be a little bit slide heavy. That's probably an effect of being in academia, right? But as we come together today to talk about our identities, I figured it might be good to start with a couple of slides on what is identity and how identity plays out within our community. Then talk a little bit about our presence within academic medicine, whether it's osteopathic or allopathic, and then review some of the concrete strategies. Because at some point I want to retire to a beautiful house in Puerto Rico. So I want to make sure that many of you consider becoming deans and vice chancellors. So please keep that in mind. As we talk about identity, I thought it was important for us to honor and acknowledge and celebrate the journey of our communities over the past 50 years, especially as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. As you know, we are now the largest non-white racial ethnic group within the United States, roughly representing 62 million inhabitants. And it's important to know when we talk about diversity, not only across the country, but also diversity within our community, what is the representation of various national groups? So by far, individuals within our community of Mexicano, Mexican, Chicano, Chicana identity is the largest proportion. 60% of our community members are of Mexican heritage, followed by Puerto Riqueño, Puerto Rican, and as mentioned by Jose, both my parents were born in Puerto Rico. I am similar to Dr. Castillo Page. I grew up in New York City in the Bronx. So I am a Nuyorican, the second area where there's a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York City, and then followed by Cuban, Salvadorian, and Dominican. And I think this is important because we want to acknowledge the journeys of all these communities. And we want to make sure that we are encouraging the youth of all of these communities to follow in the footsteps of becoming practitioners. There's been a lot of discussion that our community is largely made up of migrants or immigrants, and I would say that is the United States, but it is important to realize that recent growth within our community is primarily from births amongst first, second, third, and fourth generation Latinos, especially in the past 10 to 20 years. As you can see here, that roughly about 9 million Latinos were born to first or second, third generation Latinos, whereas about 3.5 million, still a sizable proportion. And we want to honor and give value to both. And this is what's really leading to us continuing to grow to reach about 1/4 of inhabitants in the US. When we talk about identity, this is a complicated discussion for all of us, but it is important for us to consider and to know and to be respectful of each other. When we look at the history of identity within the United States, many of us by far still associate our identity with where our parents are from or our grandparents are from, or country of origin. And then some of the other common terms that we use are Hispanic, Latino, or even American to identify. And for many in our community, they don't really distinguish much between Hispanic or Latino, or they feel comfortable using both. As you know, there's new terms emerging, such as Latinx or Latine, that also brings great value to who our community represents, with Latinx representing greater acknowledgement of gender fluidity, moving beyond the dichotomy of man or woman or masculinity or femininity. And as much as I identify as Puerto Rican, I think it's also important. I often like to identify as well as gay. It is another component of who I am as a Latino. And I think all of us carry multiple identities as a part of the community. Also, it's interesting to note, and a lot of these tables come from the Hispanic Pew Research Center, that as we move in our generations from foreign born to first to second to third or fourth, more and more we use the term American as an identifier. And I think that's also important to consider, but to also think about that although we use the word American, that doesn't mean we're less Latino or Hispanic. And I want to challenge the notion that when you consider yourself Latin American or Hispanic American, that is a personal identifier. But I do get concerned and troubled when we start classifying people as being less than because of the different identities that they choose. I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time. One of the things that I've been discussing with colleagues is that as we consider all the terms of identity within our community, it's really important to have an umbrella term that honors, respects, brings value. And so this new umbrella term that I've been introducing with some of my faculty colleagues and with the students of LMSA is Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, or of Spanish origin. Whereas the plus represents our national identities. And this is just a way to give value and a safe term for everyone to be included. I've been in sometimes discourses where if a faculty member uses the term Hispanic or Latino, they're criticized by students who might prefer to use the word Latinx. And I think we have to be careful about hearing each other, but not separating ourselves and realizing that we're one community. So, you know, this is a term that I think honors all the different terms that represent us, and hopefully will continue to ensure a safe space for greater dialogue and discussion. So I encourage you to use it, LHS Plus. In recognizing part of the mission of MOLA for our LHS Plus communities, when you ask individuals, what is one of the most important characteristics that bind us and that anchors who we are, it's really speaking Spanish. And I think one of the great things that MOLA distinctly has done has created a space for people to enhance their Spanish competence and proficiency. And that has not always been the case. And in many settings, speaking Spanish puts us at risk for significant discrimination. And so I'm grateful that MOLA, in recognition of what our community says, creates this space and continues to help us in developing Spanish proficiency. To that vein, as much as we talk about racism, it's important to acknowledge the term ethno-racism, which is a reflection of how discrimination or racism affects ethnic groups. As a community, as depicted in the census, we are an ethnic group. And the discrimination that we endure in our day-to-day lives in the general community or within our medical schools really comes under the umbrella of ethno-racism. So I'm a big proponent of, as we talk about racism, to also talk about ethno-racism to really ensure our full inclusion in discourse. I got to work with a couple of colleagues recently to talk about and to write an article on Hispanic identity and its inclusion in race discrimination discourse. And some of the things that my colleagues highlighted in this article was what does it mean to be a Latina, Panamanian, Cubana within our medical schools, and how they have struggled with reaching their optimal potential, because the minute they talk about Hispanic or Latino or LHS plus health, or talk about their lived experience, or identify as Latina or Cubana, or start speaking Spanish, they're looked at differently, they're treated differently, and at times it creates a barrier to reaching their full potential. So I encourage you, if this is something that resonates with you, to check out this article. We do know that it's important to acknowledge the discrimination that has existed within our communities, in part that we perpetuate, but also that society treats individuals within our community differently because of skin complexion, right? Or language. And so this chart, I just wanted to highlight because it ties to the prior article, looks at Hispanic experiences, LHS plus individuals' experiences with discrimination based on skin complexion, where you see, and I don't think this finding is of surprise, but it's always important to acknowledge that individuals within our community with darker complexion report higher rates of being told that they're not as smart, experiencing greater slurs or jokes, a feeling that people are suspicious of their activities or their presence and so forth. So, it is important to acknowledge that in American society, as we all know, skin complexion carries the weight of facing a higher burden, discrimination. And these forms of discrimination, unfortunately, continue to perpetuate stark, unique health issues and health disparities for LHS plus communities. I think that we've dropped the ball a little bit about in controlling COVID-19 infection rates, hospitalizations, and deaths for LHS plus community members. As you can see here, this is a table reported by the CDC, where Hispanic Latinos have the highest incidence of COVID-19 infection rates. We're second to American Indian, Indigenous communities in hospitalizations, and we're almost at the same level of death rates. And that is a huge burden on our community when you consider that the LHS plus communities is the largest non-white racial ethnic group. This is extremely frightening when you think about the trends, the increasing trends of COVID-19, the persistence of COVID-19 within our communities. So I encourage everyone to continue to be mindful of this. And I know that MOLA students have been very active in doing vaccination programs and bilingual education. And I encourage you to continue that important work. It's a little bit of a stark reality. When you think about the work of MOLA and LMSA and NHMA, it's important that our journey continues in terms of our representation in the health professions. Although representing about nearly 20%, 19% of inhabitants in the US, we only make up about 6% of physicians, 4% of pharmacists, and about 4% of chiropractors. So, for our families, our abuelos and our parents, it's really important that we continue on this journey to becoming healthcare practitioners so that they can receive culturally congruent care. We're simply not even close to that. And here you could see more of a reflection of where we're at in terms of representation within academia. The middle row titled Medicine is just a reflection and this is a combined table, not only Hispanic identity, but also African-American and Indigenous, the combined group of historically underrepresented in medicine, which cumulatively, that's about 1/3 in the US population, but only about 15% of medical students are Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous, 10% of active clinicians, and only 7% of our faculty are teachers, researchers, or leaders within our academic health centers. So just really important for you all to know, and I know you experience it on a day-to-day basis when you contact me and say, I don't have many Latinos at my school, can you connect me with a role model or mentor at another school? That is your reality in many medical schools, which I think breaks my heart and Dr. Castillo-Page's heart that has been working in this arena for so long. And here, this is just another graphical representation where when you look specifically at Hispanic faculty, it's only about 5%. It's a little bit blurry. There has been progress. Back in 1980, about 5% of medical students were Hispanic Latino, and currently it has increased to 7%, but not much, right? Not much in the past 40 years, only an increase of 4 to 9 to about 7%. And congratulations, right? You are that 7%. And the journey wasn't easy, but you should always be proud of the journey you've taken and the barriers you had to overcome. Another graphical representation of data from 2018, only about 6% of active physicians are Hispanic Latino, and only 5.5% of our faculty. And where do we stand in terms of senior leadership? And so it is overwhelming to constantly see this data, because we simply are not represented in the senior ranks. When you see professor here, it's full professor. When you see chair, it's chairs of academic departments or deans of our medical schools, primarily allopathic. And the proportions are so low, right? Only about 3% of our full professors, only about 3.5% of our chairs, and only about 3% of our deans of the 155 allopathic medical schools. Now, this includes the 4 medical schools, allopathic medical schools in Puerto Rico. So imagine if you remove the leadership from those schools, how these proportions plummet across the 151 medical schools across this country. We're going to get there, but I ask you to reflect on why this has been the case and whether people have truly made a concerted effort to support our development to become leaders. And what are the barriers that these individuals and that you will have to take on and overcome to serve in this capacity? The important thing to realize is that full professors, chairs, and deans are the leaders of these schools and determine the mission, the vision, the strategic planning, how money is spent, what is taught, who gets in, who gets to stay in, and greatly impact pathway and pipeline programs, and get to decide whether it's a monolingual medical education program or a bilingual medical education program. So as you aspire to see more bilingual medical education programs, these are the individuals that you need to touch upon. Some of you who have seen me present before know that I love just highlighting who are the Hispanic Latino identified deans of our allopathic medical schools. Back in 2019, there was 8. Currently, there is only 5. Currently, there is only 5. And what is the pattern that you see here of 4 of the 5? So what is the pattern that you see amongst 4 of the 5? And it ties to where they're located. And anyone can unmute themselves, or multiple people can unmute themselves or put it in the chat box. What is the pattern?
Están en Puerto Rico.
4 of the 5 are in Puerto Rico. 4 of the 5 are in Puerto Rico. So there is only 1 dean of an allopathic medical school. There's only 1 out of 151 medical school deans that is Hispanic Latino in Miami at Florida International College of Medicine. And I'm happy that he's carrying the mantle across the country. He's also interim, so we got to make him permanent. Otherwise, we might lose him. But congratulations to Puerto Rico. Unlike the medical schools in the US, 2 of the deans are women and 2 are men, and 1 is gay identified. So when we talk about diversity in multiple, I think Puerto Rico is doing pretty well and is serving as a model for the other medical schools in the mainland. People probably don't talk about that, but we could always remind them of that. Because only about 20% of deans on the mainland are women, but in Puerto Rico, 50%. So why does this play out? And some of the things that you should consider to understand these trends, but also to work to address, is that your journey, all of our journey into academia to be faculty, but also to succeed, is affected by multiple factors. Always at the center of anything is the individual, whether it's a patient, a medical student, a faculty member. And what affects our health, and here, this is determinants of health in academia, is the physical environment, the schools that we're in at, the social environment, how society views us and treats us, but also the policies and interventions and the access to mentors and a robust professional network. And MOLA represents that network for you to continue to be successful and grow and develop in many different ways. In addition, this is another framework as we talk about helping you on your career journey, titled Social Cognitive Career Theory. And it's the experiences that MOLA and LMSA and NHMA and different organizations, Latino, Hispanic identified, provide you that are going to give you the upper hand and allow you to be more successful than myself and others. It's the learning experiences, it's building your self-efficacy, it's our expectations around outcomes. It's facilitating your interests and goals. And I'm biased, I want you all to become future faculty. We know that the journey for you in medical school is not easy. And we know this because this is what you've told us, and this is what has been reported in the literature, that Hispanic Latino students, along with African American and Indigenous, report higher levels of stress and lower quality of life. And it is the responsibility of medical school leadership, osteopathic and allopathic, to keep this in mind and develop services to help you reach your optimal success. It is unfair and inequitable to expect you to achieve comparable scores on step 1, step 2, and to do well in your clerkships without providing these additional services, right? This is your reality, and we have to own your reality because we've created your reality and create the services to ensure your optimal success. And so this is something you could also address with faculty at your institution. Within our community, our LHS Plus identified students also have unique experiences. The medical students in Puerto Rico, because of people's lack of knowledge that Puerto Rico is a part of the US and is the oldest colony in the Western Hemisphere, often I hear the students in Puerto Rico say, when I apply for programs in the US, I'm told I'm international, which puts up an additional barrier. Students in Puerto Rico aren't international. They've been colonized. They're part of the United States, right? They are US citizens. They attend our US LCME accredited medical schools. If anything, what are we going to do to further support them, especially given that they're uniquely trained in a bilingual medical education program? And so it's disheartening when I hear colleagues say, well, I would interview the student, but I don't speak Spanish. And I'm like, the student actually speaks English as well. They can help you learn English, and medical Spanish. But these are the microaggressions and macroaggressions that our students uniquely endure across the LHS Plus diaspora. And it's important for us to talk about it and remind our faculty and staff. A more recent event that I wanted to highlight, we conducted a study of our students' performance at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, where I'm at, of student performance and clerkship grades, and found that we've been grading our Hispanic, Black, Indigenous, and Asian students a lower assessed performance than white identified students. So our students of color were being given fewer outstandings or honors, and we found that troubling. And I think it's important for every school to look at how they evaluate the students and how speaking Spanish at the bedside, talking about Hispanic health, being known as a Hispanic or Latino student might lead to you receiving a lower score in your clerkships because of who you are. So rather than viewing your lived experience as assets, you are being viewed as a deficit, and as such getting lower assessed performance, which can affect your career for a lifetime, and how we need to be proactive to address this. And I know at the University of New Mexico, we're looking how to ensure educational equity now. Specifically in considering academia, we hear you. many of you feel that many of you carry self-doubt about being good enough. You can find role models and mentors and sponsors who are like you to guide you. Know that we're out there and we need you to become future faculty. And it is your lived experiences, speaking Spanish, growing up in Miami, the Bronx, Puerto Rico, LA, that give you the knowledge and skills and the competence to address all the health inequities that we're aware of, like COVID-19 disparately affecting our communities. So those should be viewed as assets, and don't let anyone strip you of that. One of the most important things in succeeding in academia as a strategy to keep in mind is, as a community, it's good to voice, to speak up, to be loud and proud, but you gotta write. You gotta write and publish. Writing and publishing is the cachet of getting a job in academia and also being promoted. And, you know, Dr. Ortega has been phenomenal. She's recognized nationally, internationally, for building medical Spanish competencies. And I'm going to share another slide on that, but realize that there are many colleagues in our community that are writing about our narratives, and you can do it. You can write about his LHS Plus identity and be successful and be promoted. And that should never be a question. And anyone challenges that, refer them to me. I might have to make a visit to your institution just to address that. With that, I also want to just introduce a concept that I've been advocating for with my colleagues, which is, if we're going to diversify academic medicine and really encourage more diverse trainees, we have to help trainees develop foundational self-efficacy, knowledge, and skills to be successfully appointed and eventually promoted within academia. And as I showed you before, only about 6% of our faculty are Hispanic Latino, and that's insufficient. So one of the concepts that I ask you all to talk with your administration about is pre-faculty development. How do we encourage more diverse trainees, Hispanic Latino, to be future faculty? With that, this is something that I've gotten a chance to work with Dr. Castillo-Page and colleagues around the country around. And there's a lot of materials, just like Dr. Ortega has created phenomenal books around this medical Spanish interview. As you consider academic careers, there's multiple curricular and teaching materials for you to look at, written by Latinos, Indigenous, African-American co-authors, women that share their experiences and stories, and hopefully will help motivate you. And one of them is the one here, Succeeding in Academic Medicine. Important strategies to succeed in academia is working towards scholarship, whether you have education, research, or service. I want you to write about it. I need you to publish about it through the Latino lens. I need you to consider learning about the different roles and responsibilities that run a medical school, and thinking about which title best aligns with your personal and professional interests. Know that there's a misconception that academics don't make money. I make $320,000 a year. $320,000 a year as an academician. I make a lot of money. You can make a lot of money as a faculty member or an administrator. And there's a lot of my colleagues that are making a lot more money than me in academia per year. So this notion that academicians don't make money is completely false, or I question whether, I don't know, whether you can add. That's a lot of money. Realize that the experiences you get through MOLA to lead will give you foundational competences to succeed in academia. So put imposter syndrome to the side. The work you do with MOLA is going to make you an exceptional leader. Seek out congruent, like-minded mentors and role models. Continue to update your CV. Put everything you're doing with MOLA on your CV. That will give you promotion potential. And policy work and advocacy work will help you also succeed in academia. And I just, wanted to acknowledge Dr. Ortega's leadership, not only in helping or founding MOLA, but look at all the publications she's led, right? Our LHS Plus identified community members are writing and publishing and telling the stories of our communities and making us better and stronger and helping us retain our culture and identity, which is what medicine and academia needs. So in recognition of Dr. Ortega, thank you so much for your leadership. We are all learning from you and growing through you. And I think we all need to follow in her footsteps. So in summary, as much as we want others to understand Hispanic Latino culture, to succeed in academia, we also have to understand academic culture and expectations. And one of the biggest things is we need to publish. Find a niche that resonates with you. You want to be known for something. And as the example of Dr. Ortega, she is known nationally and internationally for supporting bilingual medical education. Find like-minded critical role models, mentors, and sponsors to support you. Speak up, but write and publish. You must be productive and scholarly to succeed and hopefully become an executive associate vice chancellor or dean. As much as you serve the LHS Plus community, you also must serve other communities, whether women communities. My goal has always been to serve all diverse communities. And I think that was what has allowed me to serve in this certain capacity. Most importantly, never compromise your integrity. Never compromise your integrity, your trustworthiness, your honesty. The minute you compromise your integrity, I personally feel you lose the right to serve as a leader and you won't simply be able to sleep at night. So with that, I want to say thank you again for inviting me for this very important conference. Know you could also always reach out to me, and thank you for your time.
All right, everybody, un fuerte aplauso virtual for Dr. Sanchez. Great presentation. Mil gracias por esa presentación tan fascinante. After this presentation, I feel like we got so much new terminology and things to have these important discussions. So we're eternally grateful. Acaban de escuchar 3 presentaciones súper interesantes. Vamos a hacer la transición a un segmento de preguntas y respuestas moderado por una de las fundadoras de MOLA y doctora de emergencias, nuestra querida española Pilar Ortega.
Thank you so much, Reniel. Thank you, first of all, to our 3 amazing speakers, Doctora Castillo-Page, Dr. Sanchez, and Secretary Treto. It's so meaningful for me, and I know for all of us here, to listen to you all. And I also feel like I owe to each of you in your path, sort of laying down the path in various aspects of medicine and healthcare for Latinos. So thank you for being with us today. And I know I won't be able to get to all the questions. And so if folks have other questions, please continue to put them in the chat. We hope to continue this dialogue beyond today. So please continue to put in your thoughts, your comments, your stories, your questions, and we will make sure they get to our speakers if they're directed to someone specifically, or something that we can include in a future discussion as well in MOLA. We're all about community, and that's why we wanted this meeting to be, even though it's a pretty big conference, to be meeting style, not webinar style, because we want to see everybody's faces. So thank you for many of you who are sharing your cameras and being part of that community. So I have a question for each speaker, and then we can have a little bit of kind of dialogue and conversation around it. So the first one is for Doctora Castillo-Page. So one of the things that really struck me and several of our attendees today is about the interdisciplinary nature of the work you do and of the work that, I think is necessary in healthcare and medicine. It's really no longer enough to be sort of just there as, doing your work as a physician necessarily. It really intersects with public health in so many ways. So the work we're doing is not, is not so much only in the consulting room, but it goes beyond that. And we tend to see our role kind of expanding, and within MOLA, that's certainly true. And you yourself, Doctora Castillo-Page, you have a PhD. Mario Treto, he has a JD. JP Sanchez is an MD, MPH as well, I think. Is that right, Dr. Sanchez? And so many of us have these different roles, right? So my question for you is, how do we get into that interdisciplinary space? You know, for many of us who maybe we're just trained as clinicians, or maybe have followed down this traditional path, perhaps of medicine and healthcare, how do we get into the interdisciplinary space? How do we build those teams to really make an impact?
No, great question, Pilar. And I think I would say that it's become increasingly more important to take that interdisciplinary lens, right? I think we're finding that the issues that we're tackling and the challenges are tough. And it's going to take looking at things from different perspectives if we're going to solve these big systemic issues and these big challenges in society. You know, I don't think you necessarily need to go off and go and do an extra degree if you can. You know, obviously, if you do a public health degree who brings that interdisciplinary lens, you know, that certainly can be helpful. But I think even in your journey, you can take additional courses, read about different perspectives in terms of addressing these issues from different disciplines. You know, I think about when I first joined the AAMC, and, you know, it required the work that I was doing even then required me to see where the social sciences were, where the business community was around these issues, where, you know, other industries, the legal field was in addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think it's a good approach to take and we do it, right? We also do it when you think about if you're a healthcare provider, you have an interdisciplinary team, right? When you're tackling issues with patients, right? To understand how to best provide the best care for that particular patient, right? So I think it's important to keep educating ourselves, right? And to think about different perspectives, different approaches to the work. And again, going back to the importance of collaboration, right? Even when we're in our institutions, reach out to other colleagues from other disciplines, from other parts of the organization who can bring that knowledge and that expertise to solve that particular problem.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And for directly addressing, you know, that question that I think is on a lot of the minds of folks as they're pursuing a medical degree. You know, do I pursue a master's degree in something like an MPH or not? That's a really common question. You know, how can this help me in my career? Or is that the right path to take or not? So I think, you know, it's a great path, but it's not necessarily a path that's necessary to do collaborative work as you just shared with us. So, you know, another group of folks that is really important to MOLA, and we have a huge committee dedicated to international medical and health graduates. So my next question is going to be for Secretary Treto. One of our attendees today, and many of our MOLA members are in a position where they would like to pursue medical practice in the US. They are medically trained in other countries, and many of them are seeking, you know, their licensing. So the question is, what is your perspective, and from your role in ID PFR, what is your perspective on licensing to practice medicine for international graduates? And along those same lines, somebody also mentioned that some states are facilitating a license called medical doctor assistant physician. And can you share some comments about that and kind of educate us on what are possibilities in Illinois as far as, you know, you have in your plans?
What a timely question, Dr. Ortega. I'm actually having conversations as we speak with representatives who brought this up in Illinois. Representative Teresa Ma has been a strong and fierce advocate for our international community, international residents. And so she approached me to talk about this exact issue. And so we're at the preliminary steps about how that could potentially look like, but also taking into account all the strong consumer protections that we have here in Illinois. So with that, I actually want to encourage whoever has questions related to that or perspectives. You know, when we have legislation here in Illinois, I think one thing that I'm really excited about this administration is that it's all about communication and getting perspective from all these different stakeholders. And so what a great organization. Sometimes things happen serendipitously so that, or organically rather, so that we can do some good work. So with that, I want to partner with MOLA, and I think this is actually a great question for us to work with the representative, and there could potentially be a possible pathway with how we move forward. With respect to any sort of other compact with other states, these are great timely questions. So for those of you in Illinois, we're entering the veto legislative session, but we're also working on legislative proposals for next year. And that is one topic that we're also discussing as well. So I say that, these are great questions, and they're ones that I do want to get your feedback, your input. So I would love to share, my information at this point, just in case you have any follow-up, any of the members here. My email address is just mario.treto, mario.treto @illinois.gov. And we can continue these conversations as we start making these decisions. It's very timely topics at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Treto. And when you give me your email address and a green light, you're going to have an email in your inbox, pretty much before we finish this meeting. So so we look forward to checking in with you. And I think there's a lot of voices in MOLA who would be very, very happy to contribute to this conversation and provide that input. So thank you for being open to that. And for Dr. Sanchez, so one of the things that you really brought out today is the power of publication. And I want to ask you specifically, you also suggested some new terminology, this LHS plus, for example, which is new for many of us to think about identity, or maybe what some of us are calling our Latinx identity, or Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx identity in a more concise way, new terminology. Anytime that, you're suggesting a new concept or terminology, a new way of thinking about things, how do we actually change the way people are talking about it, right? How do we actually impact academic discourse? I mean, I guess academic discourse could be one component, but also community conversations around these aspects of identity that are so complex. And so I guess the question is, how do you use publishing strategically and maybe other aspects of your role to impact how we want those conversations to go and to define the narrative from our perspective?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Ortega. I think there's two things that come to mind. One is you just want to listen. You want to just sit back and listen as you join a community, especially for the first time. Have an open mind to the culture that has existed, and learn and ask questions to gain greater insight. I think what the reason why I wanted to share that research by the Hispanic Pew Research Center was that they've summarized, after speaking with our communities across the country, and better trying to understand how we identify. And some people use the word Hispanic, some people use the word Latino, Latina, Mexicano, Chicano, Cubana. And if we are going to serve our community, we want to be mindful of how people would like to be referred to, and always giving people the opportunity. LHS Plus is an umbrella term. I don't expect people to call themselves LHS Plus. It is a way of saying that within our diaspora, there's many different identities. But collectively, we are a strong community of nearly 1 in 5 inhabitants of the United States. And I don't think as a country, we've come to acknowledge our community in the same way as other communities. And that's done a disservice to us and for us in addressing policies and practices. I think that within the culture of academic medicine, right, because you gain points differently in every community. Within the community of academia, while you're a student or a faculty member, it's important to understand how the academic community communicates and honors each other's excellence. And historically until now, and I don't see it changing in the future, the main form of communication in academia is publishing. Historically, unfortunately, we've not been supported to create a space for our identities to be accepted for publication and to exist within our teaching. If we want people, our professors and our classmates to talk more about the needs of our diaspora, then we got to pull that published material into the classroom, and we have to use it to gain gravitas. So we have to pull your publications, Dr. Castillo-Page's publications, other people's publications, bring it into the classroom and say, oh, did you see this publication that just came out on Chicano health, on Ecuadorian health? Let's talk about it. Oh, who's going to write the next paper on LHS plus health? And so I think that's something that we need to do to lead change.
Great. Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Sanchez. And I know we only have a few more minutes before we transition to our breakouts, but I want to just give a minute to each of you, our speakers, to give us kind of one little nugget that you want to leave us with today. And in particular, I think many of us as a identify as part of a minoritized group or multiple minoritized identities that may intersect within us. We often feel taxed as well. And this past year, in particular, where I think issues around race, ethnicity, and other issues are coming up, we're sometimes feel burdened by the fact that we also have to educate others around us about what it feels like, what it is like to be a part of the group that is minoritized. And so that taxation can kind of wear on us sometimes too. How do you approach that? What is, any last kind of final thoughts that you'd like to leave with our attendees today? So we can start with Dr. Castillo-Page.
What a great question. And I think that's so spot on. Unfortunately, that's something we've all been struggling with. I think we really have to practice what we preach, right? We tell sometimes for some of you that are clinicians or on that journey to take care of yourself, we have to take care of ourselves, right? And we don't do a good job at that, and sometimes I think as women, when we add that to the picture, right, we think that we have to take care of everybody else, the familia, the children, the parents. I grew up in, until most recently, I had my father with us and smaller children, and had everybody here, right, trying to do everything. But we have to carve out times for ourselves, because if we don't, we're not going to be helpful to anyone. So to find what brings you joy. I find running is good for me. No one else in my family does it. They think I'm loca. Corriendo otra vez. It brings me joy, right? To exercise, to find time, just even if it's just a little time to meet with family and friends, to make paella and drink some wine, whatever the case may be. But you have to be very intentional. And we plan it. I put it on my calendar that I'm going to take time for me. And JP is great at that. He certainly is good about taking those trips to Puerto Rico and rejuvenating. So we have to take care of ourselves, because we have a lot of work to do, and we need each other to do it. So salud y familia.
Thank you so much. Secretary Treto.
Great question. I'll talk about personal and professional guidance, but the personal, mental health is important. We often put that to the side, and just echoing what Dr. Castillo mentioned earlier. It's okay. I'm talking to a number of different high achieving professionals, and I'm sure that you constantly say yes. Something that I learned in the past year through reflection. I keep telling everyone that 2020 was the year of clear vision, a year of reflection, and now it's the year of action. It's okay to say no. It's okay. It really is, because I think we say yes to every single opportunity, every single offer You know, I know that I have a number of different events that I'm asked to go to, and I feel compelled to always say yes. But it's a huge weight on our shoulders, especially when we start thinking that we represent a whole community. And you know, I know I'm sure that you and your number of capacities, when I'm being pulled in, I'm the Latino LGBT government official in Chicago that people will pull, but that gets draining. And so take care of yourselves, put your mental health first. And on a professional level, and just kind of, you know, we're starting to see just a really polarized environment nationally with politics. And I'm frustrated that we're politicizing healthcare. I'm frustrated that vaccinations, that science is being questioned in this day and age in 2021. When you go into conversations, always assume the best in people. And sometimes when we do have disagreements, I think that it stems from a fear of the unknown. And so when people are on a total opposite, I think that when we go in thinking, you know, if we're trying to communicate our perspective, really trying to understand theirs, and then realizing that we can essentially do a lot more if we come in with good intents on both sides, because again, that I think ties well with our mental health. We need to be able to have civil discourse in this day and age, and I think that we've started to be so polarized that it's been a bit toxic. But those are the two that I recommend.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sanchez?
Yeah, so two things come to mind. You know, whenever I get stressed out, I call trusted colleagues and friends, and I often call Dr. Castillo Page and Dr. Pohl and other people. So, you know, allow yourself to ask for help. Always be vulnerable enough to ask others for help and people that you trust. Vice versa, be available to help other people. It's bi-directional, and that's what really strengthens your relationships with people within your community and across communities. So now I know I could call Mario on a couple of issues, whether it's LHS plus identity or LGBTQ identity. I think the second thing I would say to that is I am a proud product of pipeline and pathway programs. I'm a product of LMSA and SNMA. And if MOLA was around 20 years ago when I was in medical school, I would have been in MOLA, right? And I think it's important to remain active and to give back so that generations that come up behind you get to benefit and serve just as we've all benefited. So, you know, those are the two ways: lean on others, allow yourself to be leaned on by others, and remain involved in those organizations that have been developed to dedicate and advance our cause.
I have to say real quick, I'm so excited, Dr. Sanchez, because I was getting jealous of this Puerto Rican combo between Dr. Castillo and Dr. Sanchez. I was going to ask if there's a room for one Mexican man potentially in this powerhouse. So you all have my emails. If there's ever anything that I can help in Illinois, happy to help.
Oh, and one other thing, sorry, thank you, Mario. Just let me know, I'll go to Mexico. Let's do an international trip. But just because I'm also, you know, we all have goals, and Laura and Pilar appreciate this as well. So I think we all want you to come work for us, right? So I'm looking for a new executive diversity officer, a new director of our office to specifically run a bilingual medical education program. So I think, as Pilar was mentioning, international medical graduates, they are the best to run bilingual medical education programs. So I have a lot of positions that I need to hire people for. So if you're interested in working in the state with the highest proportion of Latinos, New Mexico is 50% Latino, primarily Mexicano, just text me. I'll send you the job position description.
And where Spanish is an official language too, the only one.
Beautiful. Well, we're building community. We're getting hired. We're doing all kinds of things right now. So thank you so much to our wonderful three speakers. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Reniel.
Hello.
Hey everybody, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Iñiguez. Se ve muy elegante usted hoy.
Claro que sí. Sí. I tried to put together a playlist because on Spotify they had instrumentals, but they were like really goofy, like Latinx instrumentals. And so I just typed in Google like songs with no swear words, and like most all the reggaeton songs were like gone, but there was a few. So like I don't know. We can check it out right now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. had to pull out the suspenders for this one.
Están muy bonitos los dos.
Gracias.
Gracias. Vamos a hacerlos el papá y el hijo de la novela. Hola.